It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today to come and participate in this the Journey series that Holly has put together. Let's see, if I click this, is it going to work? It is. Look at that. Okay. So as you just heard, Holly mentioned I'm an astronaut. Over my 15-year NASA career, I had the great pleasure and opportunity to fly 4 times into space. My first 3 missions were aboard space shuttles, and then my 4th mission, I trained with the Russians. I launched on a Soyuz spacecraft out of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. We flew to the International Space Station, where I served as the commander and NASA science officer of Expedition 10, which was a 6.5-month flight. I don't remember a time when I wasn't interested in flying in airplanes and rockets. I built a lot of models, read all the books, memorized all the specs of all the airplanes of the time. And I don't know where this came from because nobody else in my family seemed to have this passion. Then it turned out my mother told me about an uncle of hers in China who was trained by the Americans to fly airplanes during the war, and he went on to fly bombers against the Japanese over the Chinese mainland. So that's the only connection I have. My family is from Shandong province, and my father was born in a small town called Jiaoluo, which was our Chiao. It's over on the Yellow River near Henan and Hebei. My mother was born in Qingdao, where the famous beer comes from, of course, but at a young age, her family moved to Suzhou. After the war, my parents both found themselves on Taiwan, and they met each other in university. And then they completed their studies and got married, and then immigrated to the United States to begin graduate school studies. I never did get to meet that uncle. He survived the war, flying all those bombing missions over China, only to be tragically killed in a demonstration flight for a journalist in a trainer. And so the eyewitness accounts said that as the plane was coming down, they could see my mother's uncle looking in the back and seemingly, shouting at the passenger in the back seat. And the speculation is that he kind of lost it in the back and grabbed the stick and pushed it forward, killing them both. So I was born in the United States, in Milwaukee. My older sister was born in Taiwan. My younger sister was born also in the US. And I grew up during the 60s, during the Cold War and during the very beginning of the space race. And so that's kind of how I started getting interested in space as well as airplanes. My family moved to the San Francisco Bay Area when I was pretty young. I was 7 years old when we moved out there, so I grew up and went to school out there. My parents made a very conscious decision not to live in Chinatown or near an Asian community. They really wanted to live in the mainstream so that we could assimilate into kind of the American mainstream. And I think that was a good decision. It was the right decision, but it wasn't always easy. As always the smallest kid in the class and the one that looked different, life was kind of, sometimes hard. And once I got to middle school, things didn't get any better. And so I certainly experienced my share of what is today called bullying. But, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? I threw myself into my studies, and being a good Chinese-American kid, worked very hard, and continued to study about space and dream about it. But it really was the Apollo moon program that kind of captured my imagination, made me start thinking about possibly becoming an astronaut myself. And so even as a little kid, I knew that I had to have a plan. I mean, I already knew that, I had to do well in school. Coming from a Chinese-American family, not doing well in school was not an option. But having this dream kind of made it personal, right? So it was no longer a matter of not disappointing my parents, but it was also, I knew I had to do well in school to go to university and to even be qualified to apply to NASA. I think growing up in kind of 2 cultures helped me a lot. Living in the American mainstream, but also maintaining our Chinese culture at home taught me the values of both systems, and I think I was able to take a lot of the good things out of both. And so that qualified me to be interviewed and then accepted by NASA, and I put this up for a little bit of comic relief. This is literally about 20 some odd years and 20 some odd pounds ago. Well, it was an exciting time. As you can imagine, I packed my bags, left California, moved down to Houston, where I've now lived for about 25 years. 4 years after arriving at NASA, I had my first opportunity to go fly into space aboard Space Shuttle Columbia. We were the second international microgravity laboratory, and what that meant was in the back of the payload bay of the shuttle, instead of having a satellite or a deployable, we actually had a laboratory module, and these were the days before we had an International Space Station, so this was the main way we would do scientific research in space. We spent 2 weeks in space working around the clock in 12-hour shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, and at the end of this mission, we had accomplished over 80 different scientific investigations. Pretty quickly after I returned from that flight, I got turned around onto my second mission, was aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour. And the biggest deal for me personally, it was the first chance I had to put the big white suit on and go outside and lead my first 2 spacewalks. What we were doing, we were testing tools and construction techniques that we would later use to build the International Space Station. My third mission, I got to go fly and put some of that into practice. We were the second major assembly mission of the International Space Station. So we flew up with 2 pieces of the space station in the back of the payload bay. We went up and used the robotic arm to position those pieces on the station, and then over 4 spacewalks and 2 teams, we went outside and with tools bolted those pieces down, mated the electrical connectors, and brought them to life. We also installed the main data link between the station and the ground, and this data link is still the main pathway for all the high data rate stuff to come down, things like the video you see from space station, the telemetry of the vehicle, and some of the experiment results as well. After the landing of Space Shuttle Discovery, somehow 10 years had gone by. I had flown 3 Space Shuttle missions, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next when the chief asked me if I would join the Expedition Corps. And this was kind of something I hadn't really thought much about, because up until this point, my career had been geared towards figuring out how we were going to build that space station and then participating in building it on these 2-week shuttle missions. And so what I was being asked to do now was shift gears a little bit. I would still be a flyer, but I would be training to live and work aboard the station on what turned out to be a 6.5-month flight. So the first thing I had to do was wrap my head around, did I really want to live in space for 6.5 months, basically in a series of tin cans? That's not for everyone, not even for astronauts. And after I decided that I wanted to accept that challenge, that would be quite an adventure, the training was a whole bigger commitment. It was going to be at least 3.5 years of training. I was going to be, that's almost enough time to get another college degree. I had to learn the Russian language pretty much to a fluent level, because I was going to fly on their spacecraft as a co-pilot, and I had to spend half of my time in Russia training on their systems. I had to travel back and forth to Star City, which is just outside of Moscow. So it was 1 month in Star City, 1 month in Houston, back and forth. And all of that, by the way, since I was a federal employee, all that was in economy class. Now, the Russians had to do the same thing. They all had to commit to 3.5 years of training, spending 1 month in Houston, 1 month back in Star City. They had to learn English, because they had to train with our specialists and our mission controllers. But at the end of the day, we all decided it was worth the challenge and accepted the task. Getting to fly aboard a Russian Soyuz, this was really a neat thing, because I had flown on 3 space shuttles, and the Soyuz is quite a different beast. The shuttle is pretty roomy inside. It's definitely business class. This is definitely economy class. But this is a very reliable little spacecraft, and so it holds a special place in my heart. Launching from the Baikonur Cosmodrome was quite an experience as well. Of course, I knew about the history of the Cosmodrome and all the early work that was done there. We flew off of the same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin flew off of. In fact, April 12th will be the anniversary of his flight in 1961. Well, this was our crew. We were actually a crew of 2. We were only flying about 1.5 years after the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. So the Space Shuttle was still grounded, and during that time, our series of missions, we were responsible for going up and keeping the space station in a state of good repair until we could get the shuttle flying again, because we needed the shuttle to bring up all the other big pieces, the elements like the modules, truss elements, solar arrays, and all the big spares. And so during that time, using Russian assets only, we could only supply the station with supplies for a crew of 2, and critical supplies, things like food, water, and by the way, oxygen. Now, Solozhen's an interesting guy. He was a colonel in the Russian Air Force. In fact, at the time, he was the youngest full colonel in the Russian Air Force. But ethnically, he's an Uzbek who born and grew up in Kyrgyzia. And so he's from Central Asia. So just a little piece of trivia, he and I actually comprised the first all-Asian crew in space. Well, as I mentioned, the main purpose of the station is research, so we did conduct as many science investigations as we could. But the main purpose of our series of flights, as I mentioned, was maintenance work, so we spent most of our time doing that. You can think of the station as kind of a big house or big laboratory, and it's in a harsher environment than your house at home, right? It's out in space with all the challenges of that environment. And so just like your home at your house here on the Earth, things are always, something goes wrong. There's scheduled maintenance, there's routine maintenance, and then there's, unplanned things that fail that you have to go and fix. So that was what we spent most of our time doing. I did get to do 2 Russian spacewalks, and this was really quite a treat because I'd become a specialist in doing spacewalks and spacewalk assembly using American suits and American tools, and this was a chance to put their suit on, try that out. We went out and we installed a remote-controlled robotics experiment. We retrieved experiment packages that had been left outside by previous crews for return to the ground for analysis, and we furthered space station construction by installing navigation antennas for future visiting vehicles. Well, spaceflight really is a magical experience. I don't think anyone goes into space without having something change inside of them. And you know, it's the best thing to do. People always ask me, well, what did you do in your spare time? Well, not that we had that much spare time, but when we did, we were always looking out the window and taking photographs. And you know, that's the best part of being out in low Earth orbit. In fact, on this mission alone, I shot over 16,000 photographs of the Earth. So I'd just like to share a few with you. This is looking over the Himalaya Mountains into China. And from our perch of about 250 nautical miles up, the Himalayas look pretty small, but just remember, buried down in there somewhere is Mount Everest. This is downtown Houston. This shows you what you can do with a little bit of practice and good weather. In orbit, we're traveling at 17,500 miles an hour, which works out to almost 5 miles every second. And so you can't just put the camera in the window and shoot. You've got to learn to track the target while you release the shutter. You've got to focus. And by the way, you're weightless, so you've got to use your feet to hold on to something. You're going to float away from the window. But with a little bit of practice, you get pretty good. This is Beijing, of course. And in the middle, you can see the center of the picture. You can see the Forbidden City. This is New Orleans. This is taken in 2004, so this is before the hurricane. New York City, I'm sure you can find us there somewhere. This is the southern tip of Florida, very beautiful part of the world. The blues and greens are very spectacular. By the way, none of these photographs have been artificially colorized or enhanced. These are the raw data files I brought back from the station with me. Here are glaciers in Patagonia, South America. The Great Pyramids, you can see the 2 big ones, and then the third one, and the smaller one is just below. Sometimes Mother Nature's just funny. I saw this out the window in January, grabbed a camera, had the perfect thing to send to my wife for Valentine's Day. It's been kind of hard to top ever since, though. Well, 6.5 months was about up. It was time to start getting ready to come home. The Russian Mission Control Center asked us to put the suits back on to make sure they still fit, because in zero gravity, within the absence of gravity, your spine actually relaxes and stretches out. So you actually get 1 to 1.5 inches taller. And so they have to accommodate for that when they build your suit. Of course, being operational guys, we had a good laugh about it. What were they going to do if the suit didn't fit? We were still going to come home. Before you get too excited about getting taller in space, within an hour or so of being on the ground, you're pretty much back to your normal height. Well, here I am on the right side for entry, and you can see it's pretty cramped inside that Soyuz, made even more so by all the bags of stuff that the Mission Control Centers asked us to bring down. We landed with a big thump on the steppes of Kazakhstan. Of course, the space shuttle used to come down and land on a runway with wings. It could land on a runway, and depending on the skills of your commander, it was a pretty soft landing. Under the parachute canopy, you're still coming down at about 25 feet per second. And so 1 meter off the ground, soft landing rockets will fire to do a final braking pulse before you hit. Your seat is cocked up and it'll react against a piston to take out some of the energy. And each seat liner is custom made for each individual so that you spread the load out as much as possible along your backside. So when all that works, you hit pretty hard, but it doesn't really hurt. As sometimes happens, we tipped over, which made it even less comfortable. But the rescue crews are right on top of us. They were following us down, and they had us out in about 20 minutes. Set us up in lawn chairs, handed us satellite phones so we could call our families and tell them we were safe. After a quick ceremony in Kazakhstan, they put us back on the airplanes, flew us back to Star City. We were reunited with our families and our loved ones. And then I spent the rest of the year kind of finishing things up, writing the reports, doing the debriefs, traveling around the world to thank the teams and the individuals who had helped make our mission such a success. And then I decided it was time to go do something else. I had such a rich flying career. I had gotten to fly on space shuttles. I got to fly on a Russian Soyuz. I got to be the commander of the station, got to help build the station, and do spacewalks in both Russian and American suits. And you know, it was just time to go start doing other things and give the younger folks behind me a chance. So I started doing a little consulting work. I got involved in a couple of business ventures, and I do a little teaching on the side at Rice University and Baylor College of Medicine just for fun. I also get involved in educational outreach. I think it's very important to kind of keep people up to date on what we're doing in space, especially young people. I'd like to try to pay it forward, I guess is what they say, to try to inspire some of the kids today the way I was inspired by the space program when I was young. One organization in particular that you might find of interest is the Houston Association for Space and Science Education. It focuses on Asia, and so this organization that I work with, they actually go out and bring school kids from Taiwan, China, Japan, and Australia to come over to Houston and to Huntsville in Florida, and they spend a couple of weeks, when they're on their school breaks to learn about the U.S. space program and things that we've done. A few years ago, I was asked to be part of a White House-appointed committee to review NASA's human spaceflight plans and create option paths for the then new administration, and our report formed the basis of the new space policy. If you've been following the news about space, you know that we've had several false starts, changes in direction, and unfortunately that's just a reflection of the lack of political commitment and financial commitment, I'm afraid. But the good news is we are still moving forward. So it's been a little bit confused, but I can give you a quick update on where we are. We retired the space shuttle about almost 4 years ago after we finished building the space station. And to me, that was my personal opinion. That was a mistake. There were a lot of life left in those birds, and we should have kept flying them. But it is what it is. But we are building the next generation government vehicle, the Orion spacecraft. It's being a capsule spacecraft. It'll come down under a parachute just like Apollo did. And we can debate whether that's a better solution than wings or not. But it's being designed, the main point is it's being designed to come back from beyond low Earth orbit. That is, if we have a spacecraft that is traveling to the moon or even to Mars, this vehicle can return and has the heat shield size so that it can bring the crew down safely after that mission. We're also building a new family of rockets called the Space Launch System, or the SLS. The variation on the left will lift the Orion into low Earth orbit. The variant on the right is the heavy lift version. That's going to take the other components of a deep space spacecraft, including an Earth departure stage, which you can think of as a big fuel tank with rocket engines that'll kind of launch the stack out of low Earth orbit. It could include a lander, if you're going to go land somewhere like the moon or even Mars. And it's going to include a habitat module, some kind of a module where the crew can live during the transit time. This is called the Flexible Path Exploration Program, and this is what was adopted by the administration. The goal is to get to the right side, to get astronauts onto the surface of Mars. But the point is there are a lot of places you can go in between that are very interesting and will help you build infrastructure to allow you to explore Mars sustainably. So you've heard talk about an asteroid retrieval mission. This is what NASA is currently working on. The idea is to go visit an asteroid with a robotic spacecraft, take a piece of it off, take like a boulder off of the surface, and then bring it back into what we call cislunar space, so an orbit kind of around the Earth and the Moon. And then the Orion spacecraft will fly a series of missions, formation flying with that boulder and possibly doing some work to go down and study the surface of it. In my personal opinion, it makes a whole lot of sense to go back to the moon. Of course, there are scientific reasons to go back to the moon, but from an operational standpoint and development standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to test everything on the moon. The moon is only about 3 days away, so it's relatively close. If you have an issue, you can get your crew back pretty quickly, as opposed to Mars. When we talk about going to Mars, when the planets are lined up, the transit times we talk about on average are about 6 months or more one way. And so once you start on your way to Mars and you have an issue, you can't turn around. You don't have the fuel to turn around and come back. You're going to have to go all the way to Mars and back. So you're going to swing out there at least a year and probably more. So you want to make sure everything's going to work before you send it out there. Of course, this is the goal, getting people to the red planet. And some of the younger people who are here, or some of your kids maybe, who knows? Maybe they might be the first person on Mars. Probably the most interesting and exciting, yet the most controversial part of the new space policy is that NASA was directed to work with commercial companies to help them develop the capability of launching astronauts to and from the International Space Station. The idea is this: the technology is mature. We've been sending astronauts into low Earth orbit for over 50 years, so we know how to do it. The question is, can we create a sustainable business case such that NASA can basically buy these services from these commercial companies and then use its resources to go out and push farther and deeper into space. So 2 companies are receiving assistance from NASA right now. SpaceX has been in the news quite a bit lately. In fact, they're getting ready to launch their 6th cargo mission to the station, and they've developed their own rocket, and they're working on a version of their Dragon spacecraft that will take astronauts to and from the International Space Station. They're under contract to deliver the first flight of astronauts in 2017. The Boeing company is the other company receiving assistance from NASA. Of course, a very familiar name in aerospace. They're developing a spacecraft called CST-100, also explicitly for commercial use of taking astronauts to and from the station. In the case of Boeing, they're not developing a new rocket. They're going to use an Atlas V rocket. The Atlas rocket has been in the U.S. stable for many decades in different variants, and it's the most reliable rocket that we've ever had. So United Launch Alliance, which builds and operates it, it's a joint venture between Boeing and Lockheed. They are now studying what it would take to human rate this vehicle so it could be used to launch astronauts. The International Space Station is the decision was made fairly recently to continue operations through at least 2024. That's good news. We need the station to test out biomedical countermeasures and serve as a test bed for our systems. The biggest technical challenge of sending humans to Mars is not anything to do with propulsion or computing or navigation. It's how do you keep people healthy during that voyage. Space is actually a pretty harsh environment on the human body. Of course, in 2003, China became only the third country in the world able to launch astronauts into space when it launched Yang Liwei, and this was quite a technical achievement. In 2006, I was the first American invited to visit their astronaut training center outside of Beijing, and I got to meet Yang Liwei and Fei Junlong, the commander of the second mission, and in the ensuing years got to meet several more of the Chinese national astronauts, including Zhai Jigang, the first Chinese national astronaut to do a spacewalk. I met him shortly after his mission. China, of course, is progressing quite rapidly on space exploration. They have a docking target, a small laboratory in space, and they've flown several missions to it already. They've launched their first 2 female astronauts to their small space station. And they have plans to build their own space station starting in 2018. And they plan to start it with the boost of the core module in 2018, and then plan to have it fully completed by 2022. Well, this is the slide I want to leave you with. This, of course, is a picture of the moon. It's the shot I took from the International Space Station. The moon, of course, inspired me to want to become an astronaut all those years ago. On the left side, Mother Earth, the home planet to all of us. And that blue in the middle is kind of what I want to direct your attention to. This is what surprised me the most when I went into space for the first time and looked at the Earth. I saw this blue band as the sunlight went through the Earth's atmosphere, causing it to fluoresce these beautiful shades. And so this photograph to me says dreams. And something I've been working on for the last, since I left NASA and was allowed to work on it, was trying to advocate bringing China and the United States and our partners, our international partners together, to work together in space. You know, it's a model that we could use with our experience with the Russians. Back in the mid-90s, when we started working with the Russians, I was one of the skeptics saying, what, you know, because I grew up during the Cold War, I said, why are we working with these guys? You know, there's stuff I've learned my whole life is no good, and what do we have to, you know, we're going to have to pay for their program, and what are we doing? But then in the ensuing years, after I got to know what was going on and got to meet these people, I think the partnership in the big picture was really a big success. We were able to help them when they were down. The space shuttle allowed them to continue to operate Mir for a long time. After the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, the Russians stepped up and they helped take our astronauts to and from the International Space Station, my crew included. And I think I don't think anyone will argue that relations between our two countries, although it's not great right now, it would be a whole lot worse if we weren't working together on a very visible civil project that everybody wants to succeed. You know, so I think the same thing can be done with China. I hear the arguments against it, and frankly, it doesn't hold water. You know, they're spying on us. Well, the Russians aren't. You know, we're not spying on everyone. The other argument is technology transfer. They're trying to steal our technology. It's like, well, the Russians aren't. You know, you know, there are safeguards that can be put in place, and I don't know of any instance in our relationship with the Russians where there's been an improper technology transfer in either direction. So the same safeguards can be put into place. So I've been working pretty hard on that, and another organization I belong to called the Association of Space Explorers, they had their Congress. We had our Congress last year in Beijing. Several of the members were very impressed with what they saw. They got to go visit the Chinese Space Center. And so there's been a renewed interest in trying to bring the two countries together. And Holly's going to show a few slides from ASE Executive Director Andy Turnage tomorrow. And we've got some committee of 100 members helping out. We've got Herman Lee in Washington, D.C., Anla Cheng here in New York, and Jenny Ming in San Francisco, and I'm, of course, helping in Houston. The idea is to start the process by making it an educational thing, which is not controversial, and we can have astronauts from the United States go over to China and tour around and let them know what we're doing, and then we want to bring some Chinese astronauts and officials over to the United States and hit those major cities and kind of bring some awareness into what's going on and how we might work together and what that might mean for international relations. And I think it takes an organization like Committee of 100 with the credibility and the stature of its members to help put some weight behind this rather than just have it as a one-time thing that everybody kind of says, oh, that's kind of neat and forgets about. I think working together, if C100 and ASE can work together on this, I think it would help bring about positive change between the relationships between China and the United States. So that I'll close, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thanks.